Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara Seidler.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
Iran is experiencing its largest anti-government protests in years, with demonstrations spreading across more than 100 cities and reports suggesting hundreds have been killed in a violent crackdown by authorities. What began as economic protests have evolved into a mass movement, calling now for the overthrow of Iran's leadership, raising questions about regional stability and potential international intervention. In today's podcast, we're going to explain how these protests first started, what's happened since, and why they are so significant.
Zara, this is, of course, a really complicated but important story, and I think with any news headline such as this from this part of the world, there's important context that we need.
Yeah.
So let's start from the beginning. Can you take us back to what sparked these protests in the first place?
Yeah, so demonstrations began on the 28th of December last year, so just a few weeks ago. And the origin of these protests is really economic. They started when shopkeepers in Tehran began protesting after Iran's currency hit an all-time low. Just a day later, we had the head of the Central Bank of Iran resign, and then days after that, inflation figures showed that Iran's inflation had reached 52.6% in December.
Wow.
Really high. I mean, for reference for listeners, Australia's inflation rate in November was 3.4%.
Yeah.
And so these protests started as economic in nature. They were really driven by shopkeepers who are known to be quite big supporters of the Iranian leadership, or traditionally have been. But since they've started, they've really grown in nature, and they've now become about protesting the Iranian Islamic regime as a whole.
Okay, so there's initially this economic unrest that turns into political unrest and protests that have now grown significantly. But before we get into the political side of that, I think it'd be helpful to explain a little bit about how Iran's system of governance works. You've mentioned there that traditionally retailers, shopkeepers have supported that government, but can you explain the system itself?
Yeah, I do think that that's a good place to start because it is quite complicated. So Iran has been an Islamic republic since a revolution in 1979. So on the back of a popular uprising, Iran's US-backed monarchy, that was the Shah, was overthrown, and instead a conservative religious leader, at the time Ayatollah Khomeini, became the country's supreme leader. And so that was a very big change. Iran, prior to the revolution, had been fairly westernized. As I said, the US was fairly involved. But after and post-1979, that really changed. The regime under the Ayatollah opposed the westernization of Iran and imposed a conservative Islamic morality on the country. It established the morality police. So that did things like impose rules around behavior and dress standards, for example. And then in 1989, the former supreme leader died, and he was replaced by Ayatollah Ali Khomeini, who is still in power today at the age of 86. And so today we have Khomeini, who has oversight over most aspects of Iranian life and Iranian decision-making, though there is also a president who sits under the supreme leader. So there is a government, but then there is the religious rule of Iran, and that is the Republic of Iran.
Okay, so that political structure that was imposed in 1979 exists today, one of Islamic conservative religious law. You said the protests have grown to become about this regime at large. So what started as an economic protest has evolved into being more political.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so if the nucleus was this economic unrest, it sort of just broadened into this mass discontent, this mass movement against Iran's leadership. And so now we have protesters, as I said at the top, across 100 cities participating in demonstrations to try and call for the overthrow of Iran's leadership. Protesters have been reportedly chanting things like death to Khomeini and death to the dictator, as well as messages of support for the ousted monarchy that I told you about before, so the Shah. Now, Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of Iran's former Shah, has been very vocal throughout this time. He has urged protesters to keep going, and in a post on social media, he said the goal is to prepare to seize and hold city centres. So he is in exile, he is not in Iran, but even then he's calling for this movement, he's calling for this uprising to continue. I do just want to add, in case people feel like they are familiar with this idea of protests in Iran, that there were very sizable protests back in 2022. That happened after a 22-year-old woman, Mahsa Amini, was killed by the regime's morality police for not wearing her hijab. And while those mass protests, I would say, focused on the morality police and on women's rights, these protests are now really just targeting the regime at large and its stability, really.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of our listeners would remember the Mahsa Amini protests, and that might have been the first time many young audiences here in Australia learnt about the regime.
Yeah.
At the time, the response was a violent one.
Yeah.
Given we are now seeing a new wave of significant anti-government protests, how has the response been from Iran, from Iranian officials on the ground this time?
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
Yeah, so like last time, there has been a violent crackdown on protesters. I will just say before I talk about death tolls that it is very difficult to ascertain a single death toll. That's for a number of reasons, and I'll get into why in a moment. But one source, the Human Rights Activists News Agency, has said that at least 500 people have been killed since the protests began, with more than 10,000 people arrested. Again, we're talking about a 2-week window here. But the reason that we can't really get a lot of information is because local authorities last Thursday cut off all internet access and phone lines in the country. And so essentially, Iran has been cut off from the rest of the world. And among a host of things, that has meant that we aren't getting a whole lot of reliable information from the ground. And so I would just say that there is a lot of different reporting on those death tolls. And with Iranian authorities not confirming a single toll, it's difficult to really verify that number.
Yep.
But we have heard from the Center for Human Rights in Iran, that's a group based in New York, who said in a statement, "A massacre is unfolding. The world must act now to prevent further loss of life." We've had Iran's president call the protesters rioters and terrorists who behead and kill people, while we've had the Supreme Leader say that protesters are acting to please the president of the US.
Okay, so I'm interested in understanding then this link to the US.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're talking about the Iranian economy, Iranian political unrest, the supreme leader, the regime specifically in Iran. So what does that have to do with America?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in its most simplest form, Iran and the US are enemies and have been since the revolution in 1979. But in this specific context, Donald Trump has become involved in the local protests. So on the 3rd of January, a few days into this current protest, Donald Trump posted to X that if Iran, quote, violently kills peaceful protesters, the US will come to their rescue. He added, "We are locked and loaded and ready to go." Since then, he's been pictured wearing a hat that reads, "Make Iran Great Again." So he weighed in pretty soon after these protests began.
Basically threatening US involvement.
Correct. So in response to this, in a letter to the UN Security Council, the Iranian UN ambassador said that Trump had openly threatened Iran. He said that the US had shown a consistent pattern of intervention and coercion pursued under the pretext of supporting the Iranian people. Then on Sunday, Iran threatened to strike against US and Israeli targets if the US gets involved in the situation. We had Iran's parliamentary speaker say that in the case of an attack on Iran, all of the US and Israeli bases and ships would be a, quote, legitimate target.
Okay, so that is speaking to, I suppose, the relationship between Israel and the US as close allies.
And also the fact that since the revolution, Iran has committed to the destruction of the Jewish state. So there has been, also the relationship between the US and Israel, but also a separate relationship between, or lack thereof, between Israel and Iran, and they have traded fire as recently as last year.
Okay, so this global geopolitical context is really at the heart of this story now, Zara, and the reason why so many newsrooms across the world are unpacking it and trying to understand it. We've got domestic protests that really have the ability to broaden and impact the global community at large. The threat of all-out war basically on the table from some world leaders. What are other world leaders saying?
The majority of world leaders are really calling for restraint. So we heard from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who said he was shocked by reports of violence and excessive use of force by Iranian authorities. He said that, quote, all Iranians must be able to express their grievances peacefully and without fear. And he urged Iranian authorities to exercise maximum restraint and refrain from unnecessary or disproportionate use of force. And that idea was really echoed by the leaders of France, Germany, and the UK, who said in a joint statement that they strongly condemn the killing of protesters. So lots of world leaders really zeroing in on these reports of a violent crackdown in Iran and calling on Iranian authorities to really show restraint there. In terms of understanding, and I guess just to go back to what you were saying before, understanding the impact of these protests globally, the Islamic Republic currently backs and funds a number of groups in the Middle East. So they back Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. And so this fact alone shows why this is so significant, because a destabilization of the Iranian country's leadership could have really, really significant outcomes on the region at large.
Yeah, obviously tensions are incredibly high at the moment, but that's some very important global context, I suppose, there, Zara.
Yeah, and I do just want to end on a note of trying to capture the significance of the moment. I did speak to an Iranian journalist, Mojda Kashani, who had this to tell us.
Today, Iran is in the middle of a major uprising, and many Iranians believe it could become a revolution. Again and again, despite the risks, ordinary people have risen up. For Iranians, this is not just about prices or politics. It is a fight for dignity, freedom, and a future without fear. And as the streets feel, even under blackout, one question echoes again. Is this time different?
Zara, thank you so much for unpacking that for us, and thank you for sharing that quote there from an Iranian journalist. Some really important information, and clearly this is an evolving story, one we'll continue to keep an eye on here on the podcast and over on the Daily Aus Instagram.
Thanks, Em.
That's all we've got time for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back a little bit later with your evening news headlines, but until then, have a great day.